Welcome to Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
with me, Richard Allan.
We thought that we would spend today's session doing a bit of an update on AI policy, all things artificial intelligence and machine learning. And it seems quite timely, given that last week, even the Nobel Prizes seemed to be about nothing else than AI.
And I have to congratulate you, Nicklas, as a Swede and somebody who works at Google DeepMind. I think the prize is well deserved, and it must be very exciting to be there right now.
Well, I didn't do any of the actual work. That's all on Demis and John and the excellent team doing it. So kudos to them. I think, although I am biased, that it was really well deserved because AlphaFold is an amazing thing. But I wanted to sort of just generally note that I think, in terms of zeitgeist, it seems that artificial intelligence has reached a level now where there is a discussion about how it will actually be used. We went into this not knowing really what the technology would bring, and there was a lot of fear around things like labor replacement and displacement, a lot of fear around other kinds of risks, etc. And increasingly, it's turning out that artificial intelligence might be not just one single monolithic thing, but a range of different things with a range of different outcomes. And that seems to reflect something that I read that I thought was quite interesting by a guy called Nicklas, is that it's not just a general purpose technology like electricity or agriculture. It's actually an invention of a method of invention. And I. So it gives you new ways of inventing things, which I think is quite an ingenious way of describing a technology like this. I have to say that, from where I'm sitting, that's probably the most important thing too about the technology.
That's right. And there's been a lot of talk about it destroying creativity. It will somehow just replace all the film and image and music makers and so on. But actually, my experience so far is it enhances creativity precisely because of that inventiveness. So I have returned to software coding after quite a break, and it's just a different world when you use one of the modern coding platforms, one of the development environments, and you have one of the AI tools. All of them, people can try them. There's Claude, there's Gemini, there's Copilot. They're all really mature now, and they sit there and you say, I would like to write some code that does X. And they give you a first draft, and then they can help you if there are errors in it to fix the errors, spot what they are. But it's not the machine writing the code. You are writing the code with the assistance of the machine. So, and what that enables you to do is to be far more creative. So more people can be more creative writing software code than ever before because of the AI. It's not replaced them. It's enhanced their ability to be creative. I think that's tremendous. That's startling.
And so one thing that we can do if we want to understand this from a policy perspective and understand how it is discussed generally from a policy perspective is to say, look, let's assume for the sake of argument that the evolution of the technology is not going to be infinitely exponential. It's not going to accelerate, but it is at some point going to describe an S-curve and reach sort of a plateau of productivity, as we said in our last episode. So what do you think that stable state looks like for a technology like artificial intelligence? And what does that imply for policymakers?
Yeah. I mean, in many cases, it will be built into what you do. So, as I said, you will have a world of software coders, which we need, actually. I mean, that's the other thing. It's just that demand is increasing all the time. So the technology has arisen at exactly the time when we need more people being able to write more code because we've got more complex systems that depend on it. And so I think what you'll find is that it's built into the things that you do. We've got an aging population and more demand for medical services at just the time in which we've got AI-driven technologies that will help all of the medical profession to become more effective. We've got pandemics coming at a time when we need to be able to develop vaccines more quickly. So there's, in a sense, what we've got is a tool that allows people to do the things that we'd want them to do more effectively. So it's essential supply keeping up with demand, supply in terms of human productivity matching human need. And that's not ripping everything up and starting again. It's an evolutionary step where the kind of lives we lead today and the kind of populations we are, the AI becomes an essential tool for for delivering the kind of lifestyles that we want.
There's an ongoing debate in many AI policy circles about where the change is going to be the greatest. One possibility is, of course, that it will take what we're doing right now and allow for us to do it much more effectively. That view of the technology essentially implies that it is responding to this complexity and allowing us to increase productivity, as you put it. The other view is interesting because it's essentially saying that, yes, it will allow us to do that, but it would be a missed opportunity if we did not also start doing things differently. So instead of just making things more effective, we should make entirely new things. We should do things in a new way. We should explore and find entirely new ways of expressing ourselves, of creating value in the economy, etc. What do you think about this generally when it comes to technology around sort of the you have one axis which is effectiveness and you have the other which is innovation. How does the technology move across those two axes?
I mean, I think at this point we get into, I mean, essentially, what do humans want? Because ultimately we're the customers. The technology exists to serve us. It exists because of our creativity. And I just read a fascinating book actually about how brands are built up over time. And the core thesis is that we both like things to be new and we like them to be familiar. And so the things that are successful are the things that build on existing riffs that humans are used to in any kind of sort of creative medium or any kind of brand building. And I'm not sure why this would be different. So yes, it is possible machines will come up with something that is millions of miles away from anything that we're familiar with. The fact that it's so far away from what we're familiar with will act against its adoption. I think the things that are much more likely to be adopted are things that are closer. So take one example, which has been talked about for a long time. I think it was in the news again this week, the whole self-driving car, robo-taxi thing. You know, it seems to me that it's not settled yet, but there seems to be quite a strong appetite for AI enhanced driving, the thing we're familiar with, which is that we're sitting there behind the steering wheel, but that we have this massive array of technology that allows us to do that very, very safely, much more safely than ever before. That seems to me quite an easy lift. I think there's a much bigger question about whether you would move to a transport mode that is radically different from anything we're familiar with. That might happen over time, but I think sometimes the technologists fail to take into account human taste. They could say, look, my robo-taxi is safer than you driving in an AI-enhanced car. Yeah, it may be, but if I don't want it, then you can't sell it to me. And so we've got that gap. And I think, again, I worry sometimes the technologists are sort of almost angry with the customers for wanting to move more slowly than they should. And that, I think, would be a mistake.
And what's the role of the policymaker there? Because you can imagine the policymaker taking one of two stances. One being that, you know, the customer is always right. We should go slowly. Or they could say, look, actually, what's at stake here is fewer deaths in traffic, and that's a really important policy goal. So we should accelerate the adoption of fully automated driving. That just, you know, if that's now the case, I'm assuming that's the case. But what do you think is the you know, having an experience on both sides of the fence, what do you think is the best way for a policymaker to think about this?
I mean, policymakers don't survive if they're too far ahead of where public opinion sits.
Can I just challenge that slightly? Because I think it's interesting to think back, for example, when electricity was introduced, then policymakers took it upon themselves to almost educate people and say, look, this is going to make things so much better. There was like almost like a we want to make sure that we open the door to the future for you. That mentality doesn't seem to have that seems very alien to the way we're thinking about it. No?
No, I think you're right. So I was going to say that they don't survive if they are too far ahead, but I think a good politician has a vision of where they want to go and the baby steps, the incremental steps you need to take to get there. So I think a politician can have a far-sighted vision. So something like the transition to electric vehicles, electric heating, and so on. You know, it seems to me that I would like politicians to have a clear vision that we would like to be carbon neutral in 20 years' time. But they will need to do baby steps again. And we've seen that in Europe. We saw that in Germany with the government very challenged over the transition from gas boilers to electric heating. We're seeing a big debate around the transition to electric vehicles now. So for me, the right position for a policymaker to be in is to have a very clear vision, but to also recognize that just going out there and saying, this is good for you, take your medicine, public, is probably not going to work, and in fact could even be counterproductive. So yeah, I don't want politicians that are behind and you'll get that. There's a group of politicians who see their job as just saying no to progress. Whatever is being proposed, let's just stick with the status quo. That's not, to me, leadership. But real leadership requires the vision, the clarity of vision, but then the real human skills, the compassion, the engagement with people to bring them along with you on the journey to get to where you want to go. The ability to adjust, not be too arrogant to say, look, I thought we could get there in 2 years. It may take 4. But what I'm not going to do is just kind of abandon the whole thing. I'm going to slow my pace to get there in 4. Sometimes that's what you need to do.
And to some degree, this has to do not just with what the politician does, but with what the people want. And what the people want seems to change over time too. There's this notion in the financial industry of risk appetite. The kind of risk appetite that you have determines the kinds of deals you enter into, the kind of risk you take on. There's almost like a parallel to that when it comes to modern day politics. That is something like future appetite. So what is the appetite that people have for the future, for the long future, for sort of thinking about the future? And the inverse of that is how much does nostalgia actually govern how we think about technologies, how we think about policy? What do you think? Do you think there's a difference in balance there from when we electrify the world to the kinds of technologies that we have now? Do you think we have less future appetite now?
Oh, I'm loving some of the phrases you're coining in our podcast, Nicklas. I love future appetite. So that is an appetite for the future, as opposed to "I will be hungry tomorrow." But it's exactly. A great phrase.
I hope so. Yes.
I mean, we talk recently about sort of opposition politics is about sort of preying on disillusionment and negativity, and often opposition to a government is driven by a sort of nostalgia and everything was great before this shower of useless people came in. Future appetite is often what a government is selling, or rather a party is selling to get into government. But you're right. I think to a certain extent it has diminished, and even remember Obama was kind of hope and change, and hope and change has switched to, if you vote for me, it won't be quite as crappy as it was with the other lot, and that's a very different, much less sort of future appetite kind of message. I think you're right. There's almost a cycle. There's moments when politicians are really leaning into how we could change things for the better and expecting to get support, and there are moments where they're saying, look, I'm just not going to let things get much worse. And I think probably in a sense there was a big phase after that big financial crash, 2008-9, where everybody retrenched. And then I think COVID's had that effect again. So there's been probably a decade, good decade of retrenchment from optimism. And so you've now got, things like the climate change thing. In a way, it's almost polarized. There are some people saying it is more urgent than ever. And then there's a broad swathe of the population who are saying, but we can't afford to do it. And politicians are trying to appeal to both. But it's a long while since I saw Green parties are often in this space, they're kind of very unashamed. We're just going to change everything for the better. Vote for us kind of appeal. That feels a lot less common now than it was, say, 15 years ago, where you get the party just going, 10%, 15% of the population would happily vote for people who had completely unrealistic but super optimistic proposals just to make everything better.
How much does complexity play into this? Because you can say that, arguing for electrification is essentially saying you'll get heat and light in your home. That's going to be a good thing. But arguing for artificial intelligence, there's such a wealth of different use cases. And to some degree, arguing for the widespread adoption of a technology that's so incredibly complex is harder. So how does complexity sort of feature into this, do you think?
I mean, I think it is, but interestingly, I think one of the sort of strengths that artificial intelligence has is, look, when done well, it's almost invisible. So if I have to rip my gas boiler out and install a heat pump, that's a very sort of physical act of change to my home, and you can see why people resist that. It's very obvious to them. If my phone, the next generation of the phone that I use every day, happens to have incorporated artificial intelligence, and the designers have done it well, I almost don't notice that it's happened. So this massive revolution is happening quite an invisible way. If I send, go to the doctor for a scan, and the doctor is now reviewing it with the support of an artificial intelligence, it's invisible to me. So a major revolution has happened in healthcare that I don't need to see. If I'm the recipient of the vaccine, don't need to know, what was behind the development of that vaccine. So I actually think AI sort of done well is happening in this quite invisible way. And again, to go back to the car example, we're all using a lot of technology in our cars. I don't own a car, so I just sort of drop in and out of other people's rented cars. And every time I get in one, I'm like, oh, there's a new feature. And those features are arguably some forms of AI developed features that now have all sorts of alerts and warnings and things that people are building into cars. And they're happening quietly and incrementally, and I'm just accepting them. So I think there's a lot of that going on, as opposed to some of the hype. So it goes, out with the old, in with the new. The new is this completely different thing. In fact, what's happening is we're just improving the old incrementally in steps, and that's more acceptable to people, even though it's incredibly complex under the hood. But I don't need to know that as a consumer.
Right, and that goes to the point of actually making things better incrementally. But if you want to make radical change, of course, then it's slightly different, I suppose.
Yeah,
So,
and when you're making the radical changes, I think you'll actually hit these sort of taste issues, these emotional responses, which are not, as I say, where you say rationally the new product is better, but the emotional response is, it is so different from anything I know, I want to reject it. So that radical change, I think we're in a much more human complex environment rather than a technology complex environment.
I find it interesting too, the mental models we make of technology, because I think that those really matter too. Then the mental model that was dominating for like the first year or year and a half when it came to breakthrough artificial intelligence, say after it sort of gained, after we gained broader awareness of the technology's capabilities, that was the model of the chatbot, because that was how the breakthrough was made. And this notion of someone you're chatting with, you're writing back and forth, you can add voice, that becomes sort of a dominating mental model for a lot of people. I think one of the good things about the Nobel Prizes was that you suddenly you can shift and you can get this other additional, not necessarily like it's not a replacement, but an additional mental model, which is that, okay, maybe artificial intelligence is also something like a universal scientific instrument that allows you to see the natural world in an entirely new way. I think adding mental models like that is probably also something that's quite helpful, because one of the things when it comes to really complex technologies, either they become invisible, and I think your point is good, they become truly invisible and then people don't think about them. There's an old joke, John McCarthy used to say that as soon as something works, it's not artificial intelligence anymore. and there's somewhat of a truth to that. But I also think that there's this other problem that we've discussed a lot in relation to tech policy, which is that there's an asymmetry of knowledge between policymakers and engineers making the technology. But that asymmetry of knowledge that's one thing, and we sort of try to address that. I think the broader thing that sometimes creates thresholds or friction when it comes to the introduction of a technology more broadly is that there's this asymmetry of imagination between the people making the technology and the people using the technology, where if you're making the technology, you know a lot more about it, so you can imagine futures in which this technology can be used in entirely new ways. But that asymmetry of imagination leads to a slowdown of technological diffusion. So what happens typically is that it takes a generation for a technology to diffuse. It's sort of, if you look at the baseline studies of technological diffusion, a generation around 30, 35, 40 years perhaps is what you'd expect before you see full diffusion, even of things like the internet or computers or whatever it is. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently is whether or not there is or should be like a policy imperative to try to increase diffusion, because that's what a lot of the political rhetoric often lands at. I work with AI commissions in different countries, and they always they talk about this notion of speedy uptake of the technology, and I found myself wondering if there is such a thing, or if this sort of is a necessary cycle we go through, and if so, if that should be a desired policy target. What do you think?
I mean, I think to think of the health of your, I'll focus particularly on the economy, but the health of your society depends on the health of your economy in different terms, which include the extent to which particular technologies have been diffused, I think could be extraordinarily helpful. So you're actively setting a target, because the risk at the moment is we have policy announcements where there's lots of warm words on productivity. We want productivity, we want a better climate, we want economic success, all of this stuff. But all of the real policy action is on regulation that is likely to run counter to the vague aspirations. You've got vague aspirations on one side, concrete policy proposals on the other side, and the two are in conflict. And I think it would be quite a game changer if you were to say, look, we accept that we need to get to this stage. Like, this is what a healthy economy would look like. There used to be this sort of internet readiness indexes, and you get these sort of technical readiness indexes where you're looking at society and seeing how ready they are for the diffusion of technologies. But I think
there are
to
AI
have that
policy
in mind,
indices as well. Yeah, there's similar things for AI. Yeah.
But, I mean, the one area where they have gone and done it is around climate change, and so there are legally binding targets for reducing carbon emissions, and people are squealing because of that. It's like it's causing pain, but that's one place where you've put the legally binding targets in place, and that does affect change. But that, as far as I'm aware, there's none of that in the technology space, for example. There's nobody saying this is the kind of technological diffusion we would like. I guess there's been some around things like internet speeds. We want to have this level of connectivity around the country.
What about public sector internet accessibility, that you have to make things accessible over the internet? There are targets like that, right?
I mean, some governments have set some. Again, they tend to hit issues about the structure of government and trying to get everybody to row in the same direction. So there have definitely been some that have been set, but they're not sort of cross economy, as it were. So they're not saying, the United Kingdom, we would like to have AI supported services across this percentage of these sectors of the economy. It's nothing as broad as that. Whereas we are saying something comparable for something like carbon. We're saying we want carbon reduction, and we got mechanisms for it. Can you imagine AI trading credits? Oh no, that'd be a disaster. But yeah, some sort of
don't
as
give
good
any
as the
more ideas
carbon.
now,
Yeah,
right?
but you know what I mean. I think what I'm saying is they've created mechanisms that sort of force the carbon transition. There's nothing comparable, I think, at scale. There's rather tweaks, quite often low-hanging targets for bits of government to build a website. Which is not so necessarily transformational. But I think it's a really interesting concept to explore. If a very ambitious government that's ambitious for its economy might do that and say, we're looking ahead and we're saying in 10 or 15 years' time, this is what will make us successful. Actually, I could imagine, a country like India doing this, perhaps even ahead of some of the European countries and countries that are, sort of got a lot of legacy interests, sort of advocating for status quo. But yeah, it would be a really interesting experiment for a country to set out that kind of ambitious target.
The economics prize that was announced today, actually, as we're recording, was given for research into the role of institutions for democracy. And one of the things that, as the technology matures, as it becomes, as we have stronger, richer mental models of the technology, one of the things you have to look at, I think, from a policy perspective and from a corporate perspective, is to think through, okay, what about institutions? how would we design these institutions today if we knew what this technology can do? And I think there are many super interesting examples. Science is just one. How would you organize science if you knew that you had access to a tool that could allow you to find patterns in extremely complex data sets, for example? How would you sort of make that tool available to all different kinds of sciences? It's like you reorganized science to some degree when you found the microscope, when you found the telescope. So how would you actually reorganize science as an institution around this technology? It's one interesting question. But there are also more specific, interesting questions and institutions that I find could be super powerful to engage with, and one of them, of course, is statistical agencies. Because when statistical agencies were put in place, they were put in place because people governing realized that if we don't have any readability of the world around us, if we can't understand it with facts and numbers, then we're not going to be sure whether or not our policies are working. We're essentially playing chess in a dark room with we don't know who, and it's not necessarily going to be obvious that we're winning or losing. And so, to some degree, the statistical agencies provided this readability of the world, made the world readable. And if ever there has been an opportunity in choosing which domains you want to make readable in society today, it's with the advent of artificial intelligence, because to some degree you can now deal with all of these different domains and learn from them in a much, much faster way than you could before. So how do you go about that? How do you go about addressing the redesign of fundamental institutions in the economy when the technology shifts?
Yeah, as you're talking, it just making me think that the last government, or last but one, I've forgotten how many. We've had a lot in the UK for a while, but that they had one phase where the idea was sort of government by dashboard, that they were going to work with AI companies to kind of have dashboards that would let them have this real-time vision of everything that's happening across the United Kingdom. And to a certain extent, that sort of was made material in COVID time for different bits of government. I mean, I certainly think there are improvements that could be made, but I still think a lot of the real thinking that needs to go on, and this actually takes all the way back to that sort of inventiveness point you made, is around the questions that you should be asking. So there are like lakes of data out there. And statistical agencies have got superb data, and health services have superb data that's out there. But the really productive piece for me is getting better at figuring out what questions we should be asking and what we should be looking at. And the AI can help. So that's one area where novelty really does help. As I sort of said earlier, in the sense that if products that people are using are too different from what they're familiar with, there's an issue of rejection. But for somebody using the scientific method, whether that's a government policymaker or an actual scientist, to have the AI create novel questions that you would never have thought of is hugely valuable. And you're not going to be scared of those. You're going to go straight after them. So I think that actually has a huge potential if people in government could use AI to help them identify the questions that they've not been asking. And they'll probably find that the data is there to get them a long way towards answering those questions. That could change government quite dramatically and allow them just to look round corners and see into the blind spots that they've had for years.
And it seems to me that that's a great area also for the kind of hybrid productivity that you highlighted with software coding. And so you could imagine this hybrid artificial curiosity that could emerge from the technology. And if you could really design and build the institutions of artificial curiosity, because I think that's also a really good index, actually, to think about. The level of curiosity in a society overall is probably indicative of its democratic health. So how curious is your society is an interesting question to ask. And these technologies, I mean, we talk about intelligence a lot, and artificial intelligence is sort of the classical way to think about this. But maybe one of the things we should think about is what it actually enables us to do. And if it's a curiosity augmentation device, then I think it's incumbent on us to become a little bit more curious about the world.
Yes, and to be able to do that, as I say, with this sort of novelty injected, which is, I mean, again, my experience was other people may be familiar with, and if they're not, they should go out and do it. But if you get a tool, there's Google obviously this one called Colab, and if you've got an account, you just go to Colab and you start writing code, and this Gemini tool helps you to write the code. And if you're at all curious, you start going wonderful rabbit holes of trying to find out how you can do things with the code that you would never have done on your own. So that ability to sit there with a partner who is helping you to be more curious and then test your ideas is fantastic. And so, yes, people in government, civil servants, I mean, the classic sort of top-down model is the minister says, could we look at a policy on X? And the senior civil servant says, yes, I'll get 5 people to run off. And they go to 20 more people. And there's a whole sort of tree of analysts working on it. And the answer comes back in 3 months. We still want all those analysts, but the idea of them working more in a sort of flat structure where they're all being curious and all asking multiple questions and all being prompted with data and questions they hadn't thought of with the initial query, seems to me that will produce a much more interesting set of options to go back to that minister who ultimately should decide, because that's the democratic process. But we can make that whole process much richer by encouraging curiosity, by moving from this linear, top-down tree structure to a flat structure of people being curious and then pooling their findings together and then querying them again and then, until they're ready. Yeah.
And maybe that sounds to me like an excellent argument for thinking about the role of experiment in governing. Does that seem right to you?
It does, and the fact that, again, with the tools we have now, you can experiment without harming people. So you can create these.
No citizens were harmed in this experiment.
You can create these sort of wonderful environments in which you're testing things. And again, that's from code world. Now you've got these tools where you do this rapid development, you test everything, and you're not running it live, but the tests are valid. They're really important and informative. Doesn't mean it's always perfect when you go live, but it's much, much better than it was back in the day when, the only way to test an idea out was to release it into the world.
And I think it's an interesting, if we sort of end on a policy note, I think it's an interesting question is how are you thinking about experiments in an institutional context and a policy context? Because once you get the opportunity to do real experiments this way, it's going to, I think it's going to change the game fairly foundationally. And you see it, there's actually been a paper that we can leave in the show notes that came out just yesterday, showing how you can make experiments in strategic management without harming any actual employees. So there's now really good models for experimenting in how you devise different kinds of management methods. And of course, getting back to sort of artificial intelligence in science, one of the ideas is that if you can move from experiments in vitro, in sort of biological time in real life, to experiments in silico, where you could run 1,000 or 100,000 experiments in the same time it would take you to run one in vitro, then the pace at which you could advance your curiosity or our organized curiosity, which is a good description of science, would increase manifold. And that, I think, would have a profoundly good and hopefully also deeply transformative effect on our economies and societies, and perhaps increase our future appetite, to get back to my newly coined word.
Future appetite, and the other one, policy making in silico. I'm very excited by
that. Yeah, me too, actually. And there will be people who will say that maybe most policymaking should remain in silico, but that's not the sort of that will ultimately be a political choice. Well, so lots of interesting things happening with artificial intelligence. And as we look at it as a policy area, just to wrap this up, what do you think, if you were sort of recommending a policymaker to accept to go code, which I think is actually a really interesting recommendation, because you get a sense for how much productivity increase you can get, and you also get a sense for how much you can sort of work with in a hybrid way these technologies. But what would be your advice to a policymaker who's interested in figuring out this technology?
I mean, my advice to the policymaker, actually, and to the people making the products is, can we have a bit more attention focused on the ordinary, boring day-to-day uses of AI and a bit less focus on the killer robot? Because that's what I fear, is that the policymaker, when they're regulating, keeps in mind the killer robot and accidentally stops the enhanced anti-lock braking system, which is what they want in their car. So I think it's incumbent on everyone to look at those small incremental improvements that are AI driven across a whole broad range of products. That would be lovely and lead, I think, to better policy making.
Excellent. And on that note, thank you very much for listening.